It was supposed to be her ultimate secret, a soundproof, subterranean room dug entirely by hand beneath a rotting Montana barn, hidden from every eye in the world. She built it to disappear from a monster who wore tailored suits and spoke in the measured tones of a man who had never lost a single thing he wanted to keep. She never imagined that the sky itself would become a different kind of prison, but that understanding came later. First there was the darkness. First there was the trembling hand reaching for the iron latch. In the pitch black, the sound of deliberate footsteps moving across the floorboards directly above her head, and the absolute certainty that the man who had spent 3 years hunting her had finally arrived. We will get there, but to understand how Eleanor Marsh ended up sealed beneath 8 feet of frozen Montana earth, with a dead man somewhere above her, you have to go back to a dining room table in Boston. You have to go back to the night she understood that the law would never save her. That night began with the piece of paper. It was the autumn of 1880, and Eleanor had been married to Cornelius Aldridge for 14 years. 14 years of learning the particular geometry of his silences, of reading the temperature of a room by the angle of his shoulders, of understanding that his version of anger was never raised voices or broken dishes. Cornelius Aldridge expressed displeasure through architecture. He rearranged the world around you until you had no room left to stand. She had discovered the document by accident, the way most terrible truths surface, not through investigation, but through a moment of ordinary carelessness. She had been looking for the household ledger in his study and found instead a stack of legal filings tucked beneath a copy of the Massachusetts Civil Code. The property transfer was dated 3 months prior. The house on Beacon Hill, the one her father had built with his own money and left to her alone in his will, the one asset in their marriage that belonged entirely to Eleanor, had been quietly signed over to a shell company called Aldridge Holdings Trust. She had no memory of signing any such document, but there was her signature, neat and complete on the final page. She brought the papers to the dinner table that evening. She set them beside his plate without a word and waited. Cornelius did not look up immediately. He finished cutting a piece of beef, pressed it into the sauce on the edge of his plate, and chewed with the unhurried patience of a man who had been expecting this conversation for some time. Then he looked at the documents and then at her, and his expression held nothing more dramatic than mild interest. "You signed those in March," he said. "You don't remember." "I remember March," Eleanor said. "I was ill. You brought me a stack of papers and told me they were household insurance renewals." He set his fork down very precisely. "That is a serious accusation, Eleanor." "It is an accurate description of what happened." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork again. "The signature is yours. A notary witnessed it. You would have a very difficult time explaining to anyone why your own name on a legal document does not reflect your intentions." He paused. "Particularly given your recent state of health." That was the whole of it. No shouting, no threats, no dramatic confrontation. Just the quiet, airtight presentation of a fait accompli delivered between courses at a dinner table in Boston while the candles burned low. Eleanor sat across from him and understood something she should have understood years earlier. She was not in a marriage. She was in a case that Cornelius Aldridge had already won. She went to see a lawyer named Harrington the following week. He was 60 years old, well respected, and had handled divorce proceedings for 3 women of Eleanor's social standing in the past decade. She brought the property documents and a written account of the past 14 years, the frozen bank accounts, the intercepted correspondence with her sister Margaret in Philadelphia, the quiet campaign to isolate her from every friend and employer until she existed in a kind of social solitary confinement. Harrington read everything carefully. He asked 3 questions. Then he set the papers down on his desk and removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose with the weary precision of a man performing a calculation he did not enjoy. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said. He did not meet her eyes. "Your husband visited my office on Tuesday." Eleanor went very still. "I am returning your materials," Harrington continued. "I am not able to represent you in this matter." He slid the folder across the desk. "I have a family," he said quietly. "I am sorry." She walked out of his office into the October cold and stood on the pavement for a long time. She was not crying. She was thinking with a clarity that felt almost physical, like cold water moving through her chest. The courts would not help her. The lawyers would not help her. The restraining order she had obtained the previous spring had been treated by Cornelius as a minor inconvenience, a piece of paper he acknowledged and then set aside the way one sets aside an unflattering review. There was one thing left. She could disappear. She began that same afternoon. What Cornelius Aldridge did not know, what he had never bothered to learn in 14 years of marriage, was that his wife was not the product of Boston finishing schools and parlor educations. Eleanor had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the eldest daughter of a man named Harold Marsh, who made his living sinking wells. She had spent her childhood standing at the edge of holes in the earth, handing her father tools, learning the vocabulary of underground spaces, how to read the color of soil layers, how to calculate lateral pressure on a timber frame, how to sink a vertical shaft through dense clay without losing the walls. Her father had given her 2 things when she left for Boston at age 19 to take a position as a governess. The first was his worn leather Bible. The second was his set of masonry chisels wrapped carefully in oiled canvas. She had carried both through 14 years of marriage, stored in the bottom of a cedar chest that Cornelius considered beneath his notice. She sold her mother's pearl earrings and the gold chain her sister had given her at her wedding. The total came to just under $200, enough for a train ticket to Helena, Montana territory, 3 days on a hired coach to the settlement of Harlow Creek, and the filing fees associated with a homestead claim under a name she constructed from memory, Clara Finch, widow of no particular place. The homestead application was processed by a land office clerk in Helena who was more interested in his noon meal than in the provenance of the woman seated across his desk. 160 acres in the Bitterroot Valley, recorded under the name of a woman who did not exist, filed on behalf of a woman who intended to cease existing entirely. Eleanor Marsh arrived in Harlow Creek on a Tuesday in late March of 1881, carrying a carpet bag, her father's chisels, and approximately $40 in cash. She asked no one for directions. She had studied the land survey maps in Helena until she could draw them from memory. The property was everything the land agent's description had implied and nothing more. The farmhouse was a two-story structure of whitewashed board that had not been whitewashed in some years, its windows filmed with the particular gray of long vacancy. The barn behind it was massive and elderly built, sometime in the 1850s from old-growth Montana oak, its roof sagging in the center like the back of a tired horse. Inside the barn, in the far corner where the horse stalls had once been, the floorboards had rotted through, entirely exposing the earth beneath, and that earth sat 6 inches lower than the surrounding floor. Eleanor stood in that corner in the gray March light and pressed the toe of her boot against the soil. It was dense, compacted iron hard. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against it and felt the faint hollow resonance of something below the particular acoustic quality of earth that has been disturbed before, that holds a memory of being moved. She went back to the farmhouse and started a fire in the kitchen stove. While the water heated, she unwrapped her father's chisels from their oiled canvas, laid them on the kitchen table, and looked at them for a long moment. Then she began to plan. She did not begin digging until May, when the ground had thawed enough to work, and the rains had started providing the noise cover she needed. She worked only at night, only during heavy rain, and only with the barn doors sealed against the casual glance of any passing traveler on the county road a half-mile distant. The crib-lining method was what her father had used for deep wells in Pennsylvania clay. You drove the vertical shaft, and as you went down, you built the wooden frame inside it tier by tier, each new square of oak planking locked into the one above. The earth pressed inward, the frame pressed back. Done correctly, the walls would stand indefinitely. Done incorrectly, they would fail all at once, and you would be buried in a matter of seconds. Eleanor had watched her father do this 100 times. She had handed him the tools and counted the nails and learned the critical measurements by feel long before she understood them by calculation. She applied the same principle laterally, excavating horizontally beneath the barn floor and framing the space as she went, one section at a time, 3 feet of progress per night on a good night, 1 foot on a difficult one. She hauled the excavated soil out in canvas bags and carried it to a ravine at the back of the property, scattering it under dead brush and fallen branches to blend with the surrounding terrain. Her hands blistered and bled and formed new skin over the blisters and bled again. Her shoulders ached with a depth that made sleep difficult, and she woke most mornings unable to straighten her back for the first hour. Every shovelful of earth she moved was a payment towards something she could not yet name. Safety was too small a word for it. What she was buying, one canvas bag at a time, was the right to breathe without listening for footsteps. The space she carved out measured 14 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet from floor to ceiling. She laid a stone floor from flat granite pieces she hauled in from the creek bed 2 miles away, working by lantern light, fitting the stones together with the patience of someone who understood that the work itself was the point. She built the walls of oak planking and lined them with heavy wool batting she ordered through the dry goods store in Harlow Creek under the name of Clara Finch. The lighting came from whale oil lanterns, the marine kind designed for enclosed spaces on ships, which burned cleaner than ordinary household lamps and produced less carbon accumulation in an enclosed space. She mounted 3 of them on iron brackets along the walls. For ventilation, she ran 2 ceramic drainage pipes at a shallow upward angle through the wall and out through the barn's foundation, disguising their exterior openings as ordinary drainage channels running down the outer stonework. She fitted each pipe with a removable clay plug and a wire mesh screen against insects. The entrance was the masterpiece of the entire construction. In the corner of the barn's old horse stalls, directly above the hidden room, she built a trapdoor from 3-inch oak planking sheathed in scrap iron from the rusted farm equipment she had found on the property. The door was heavy enough that no single person could lift it by brute strength, but Eleanor had not planned for brute strength. She had planned for mechanical advantage. The rear axle of an abandoned hay wagon lay rusting in the weeds behind the barn. She cleaned it, greased it, and installed it as a counterweight system, running the axle through a timber frame above the trapdoor with iron cables she ordered through the Helena Mail catalog. The counterweight, loaded with granite stones from the creek, balanced the door's weight precisely enough that a single downward pull on a handle would swing it open, and a single upward push would close it again. The whole mechanism was concealed beneath the barn floor. Over the trapdoor itself, she laid new floorboards that matched the surrounding planking so precisely that you would have had to know exactly where to look, and then look very closely. Over those boards she positioned the iron frame of a broken single-furrow plow which weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds, and which she had spent 2 evenings moving inch by inch from its original location across the barn floor. She packed straw around the plow frame until the corner looked like nothing more than a neglected storage area that had not been disturbed in years. To open the entrance, she had to move 2 specific bales of hay, slide a concealed iron pin in the plow frame, and then pull the wooden handle hidden beneath the 3rd bale. The counterweight did the rest. By November of 1883, the room was finished. The night she completed it, Eleanor descended the ladder for the first time with a lit lantern, hung it on the first bracket, and stood in the center of the stone floor. The walls were close but not confining. The ceiling was high enough to stand beneath without stooping. The air smelled of earth and wool and lamp oil, which was to say, it smelled like the inside of her father's tool shed, which was to say, it smelled like safety. She took off her boots. She sat down on the wooden crate she was using as a temporary seat until the proper furniture arrived in the next week's supply order. She let the silence settle around her. In 14 years of marriage to Cornelius Aldridge, she had never once felt certain that she was alone. Even in rooms where she was physically by herself, there had always been the awareness of him, the gravitational pull of his attention, the sense of existing within the field of his observation. The farmhouse upstairs, with its thin walls and its windows that looked out on the county road, had felt only marginally safer. Down here, for the first time in longer than she could honestly calculate, she felt the specific quality of solitude that comes from knowing with physical certainty that no one in the world knows where you are. She did not cry. She simply sat and breathed and let the silence be what it was. 3 weeks passed. The first hard snows came. Eleanor moved into the farmhouse's winter routine, cutting wood, banking the kitchen stove against the deep cold that descended each night, making her careful twice-weekly trips to Harlow Creek for supplies. It was on one of those trips that she first had a real conversation with Agnes Whitmore. Agnes ran the dry goods store on the main street of Harlow Creek with the unsentimental efficiency of a woman who had outlasted a husband, 2 business partners, and several winters that had killed stronger people than herself. She was 62 years old, sharp-faced, and possessed of the particular perceptiveness that develops in people who spend their working lives reading customers across a counter. Eleanor had been trading at Agnes's store for 8 months, always under the name of Clara Finch, always paying in cash, always polite and brief. She had believed herself unremarkable. Agnes disabused her of this notion on a Thursday afternoon in early December, when the store was empty of other customers and the wind was pressing at the glass with the irritable persistence of something that wanted in. Agnes set Eleanor's supplies on the counter and looked at her hands. Not her face, her hands, the thick calluses on the inner fingers, the broken nail on the right index finger that had grown back slightly crooked after being crushed against a stone, the particular roughening along the heel of the palm that comes from sustained tool work. "You're not who you're pretending to be," Agnes said. Not an accusation, a simple statement of observed fact. Eleanor met her eyes and said nothing. "I've been around long enough," Agnes continued, "to know the difference between a woman who works hard and a woman who has learned to work hard because her life depends on it." She began wrapping the purchases in brown paper. "I don't need to know the details, but I need to ask you one question, and I need a straight answer." "Ask it." "Are you running away from something, or are you preparing for something?" Eleanor considered this for a moment. It was, she realized, the most precisely accurate question anyone had asked her in 3 years. "Both," she said. Agnes nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had already decided. She did not ask anything further, but from that day forward, certain supplies began appearing on a shelf behind the counter, set aside, and unlabeled lamp oil in the quantities Eleanor needed, dried provisions in the varieties that stored well, hardware items that had no obvious homesteading purpose unless you were constructing something underground. Agnes never commented on these items. Eleanor never thanked her for them specifically. The arrangement existed in the efficient silence of 2 women who understood each other without requiring it to be said. It was Agnes indirectly who helped Eleanor understand the situation with Deputy Marshal Silas Greer. Greer had visited Oak Hollow Farm 3 months after Eleanor's arrival, conducting what he described as a routine welfare check on new homesteaders. He was a lean, weathered man of 42, with the careful movements of someone who had learned early that mistakes in this country had permanent consequences. The visit had been courteous, unhurried, and had left Eleanor with the uneasy conviction that she had been studied far more carefully than the conversation's surface suggested. Before leaving, he had paused at the edge of the property and said, without looking at her, that a wire had come into his office from a legal firm in Boston asking about a woman matching her general description who might have settled in the Bitterroot Valley. He had not yet replied to it. He mentioned this the way a man might mention the weather conversationally without apparent weight. She had understood the weight perfectly. Agnes, when Eleanor mentioned this exchange, had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Greer took out a loan from the Helena Bank 2 years ago after the drought, backed by the county deed on his property. It comes due in March." She had said this while stacking tins on a shelf, not looking at Eleanor. A man with a debt like that is not entirely his own man. You should know who you're dealing with. Eleanor had gone home and thought about this carefully. The following week, she went to Greer's office in Harlow Creek and sat down across from his desk and looked at him directly. She placed a sealed envelope on the desk between them. Inside was $50 in cash and a single handwritten sentence: "I am asking you not to know that I am here." Greer looked at the envelope for a long time. Then he pushed it back across the desk to her. "Keep your money," he said. He looked out the window at the gray December sky. "I won't know you're there, but if he comes with a court order, Mrs. Finch, I can't help you." He paused. "A court order from Boston doesn't carry much weight in Montana territory, just so you know." Eleanor took the envelope. She stood. "Thank you, Deputy. I'm not doing anything," he said. "That's the point." She walked back to her wagon through the cold Harlow Creek afternoon and felt the precarious balance of the situation with the particular clarity of someone who has learned to take honest account of her own position. Greer was not an ally. He was a man trying to remain honest, while a debt eroded his independence from beneath him. He was, in other words, a decent man in a bad corner, and decent men in bad corners were the most unpredictable kind. She drove home through the early dark and stacked another cord of firewood against the farmhouse wall, and went to bed that night listening to the wind moving across the Montana plain. 3 weeks later, she woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of horses' hooves on the frozen road. She lay still in the dark and listened. The sound slowed, stopped. She rose and crossed to the window and looked out. At the far end of her half-mile drive, barely visible in the thin moonlight, a mounted figure sat motionless at the property line. The horse's breath rose in small clouds. The rider did not move. 4 minutes passed, then 5, then 6. Then the figure turned the horse and disappeared into the dark without any sound at all. Eleanor stood at the window for a long time after. In the morning, she walked out to the road. The ground was too frozen to hold clear prints, but at the gatepost pushed down over the wood in a way that required deliberate placement rather than accident was a white rose. The cold had taken it overnight. The petals were rigid, translucent at the edges, and one of them had broken off and lay in the frozen dirt at the base of the post. She looked at the rose for a moment. She did not touch it. She walked back to the farmhouse and went to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed and unwrapped her father's chisels from their oiled canvas. She carried them to the kitchen table and sat down and found the whetstone she kept in the drawer and began to sharpen the largest chisel with long, unhurried strokes. She worked until the edge was right. Then she wrapped them again and set them in the center of the table where she could see them. I had found her. She did not know how, not yet, though she would eventually conclude that the property tax filing under Clara Finch had been traceable to a postal address she had used once carelessly in a moment of practical necessity. It did not matter how. What mattered was the timing of his appearance, arriving not when the roads were clear and the sheriff accessible and witnesses available, but now at the front edge of the worst weather the region had seen in memory. She looked at the chisels on the table. She thought about the room below the barn, its stone floor and wool-lined walls, its counterweighted door, its 14 weeks of provisions. She had built it as a last resort. She had hoped never to use it. She understood now that hoping had been the luxury of someone who still believed the situation might resolve itself without requiring everything she had. Outside, the sky to the north had taken on the particular bruised purple of serious weather coming fast. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunrise. The cottonwoods along the creek were bending in the wind with the resigned flexibility of things that have been through this before and know there is no point in resistance. Eleanor Marsh stood in her kitchen in the last warmth of the stove she had built that morning and looked out at what was coming and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not calm exactly, not readiness exactly, something older than either of those things. She was her father's daughter. She knew how to go underground, and she knew how to hold the walls up while she was down there, and she knew that the most important quality of the earth, the thing her father had told her when she was 8 years old, standing at the edge of her first well, was that it did not care about you one way or the other. It was not hostile. It was not protective. It was simply there and heavy, and if you understood it correctly and treated it with the right combination of patience and force, it would hold. She put on her coat. She went out to finish the morning chores. Above her, the sky continued to darken, and the wind picked up, and somewhere on the road that ran between Harlow Creek and the rest of the world, a black lacquered Boston carriage was moving through the gathering storm toward Oak Hollow Farm. The carriage came at 2 in the afternoon, just as the first real snow began to fall. Not the soft, tentative snow of early winter that drifts down like an apology. This snow came in hard and sideways, driven by a wind that had been building since morning across 200 miles of open plain, gathering force the way a debt gathers interest, quietly and then all at once. Eleanor was standing at the kitchen window when she saw it turn off the county road and start up her drive. She had seen hundreds of vehicles on that road in 2.5 years, farm wagons with their loads of hay and barrel staves, the mail rider on his speckled gray, the occasional buggy from Harlow Creek. She knew by sight every conveyance that belonged to this landscape, the way you know the faces of people who live on your street. The carriage coming up her drive did not belong to this landscape. It was black lacquered wood with brass fittings, the kind of vehicle that existed in Boston and New York and Chicago, built for cobblestone streets and covered livery stables, not for frozen Montana dirt roads in a December storm. The horse pulling it was a dark bay, thoroughbred 17 hands, at least the kind of animal that cost more than most men in Harlow Creek earned in a year. Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the counter with a steadiness that surprised her. She had 4 minutes. She knew this because she had rehearsed it not once but dozens of times, lying in the dark of her hidden room in the weeks after she found the white rose at her gate, running through the sequence with the methodical precision her father had used when teaching her to set a well casing before the shaft wall could shift. You did not think through an emergency when you were in it. You thought through it beforehand until the actions lived in your muscles rather than your mind. She moved immediately. She crossed to the bedroom and pulled open the wardrobe and grabbed a random collection of clothing, a wool skirt, a shirtwaist, a pair of stockings, and carried them to the front room where she dropped them in a heap on the floor beside the overturned chair she had already knocked sideways on her way through. She went to the kitchen and turned the burner on the wood stove to its highest setting and positioned the iron kettle directly over the flame. She opened the back door and let the full force of the storm pour through the house wind, screaming through the gap and scattering loose papers from the kitchen table across the floor. Then she stepped off the back porch into the snow. She ran in the direction of the tree line, not the hidden room, not safety, but east toward the pines that marked the edge of her property, and she ran hard enough to leave deep panicked footprints in the accumulating snow. She ran until she reached the first trees, until she was out of the sight line from the driveway, and then she stopped, turned, and moved west at a careful walk, placing each step with precision, staying in the shadow of the barn's long north wall, where the overhang had kept the ground relatively clear. Behind her, at the front of the farmhouse, she heard the sound of the carriage coming to a stop, the creak of the brake, the stamp of the thoroughbred's foot, a door opening. She did not look. She pressed herself against the barn's exterior wall and moved toward the side entrance with the focused economy of someone who has rehearsed this exact motion until it required no thought at all. Her hand found the iron latch. She pulled the door open 6 inches and slipped through and pulled it shut behind her without a sound. The barn interior was dark and cold, smelling of dry rot and old straw and the ghost of horses that had not lived there in 15 years. She crossed to the far corner in the dark, navigating by memory, stepping over the specific board that creaked near the third stall post, moving around the rusted harrow that sat 2 feet left of center. She reached the plow frame. Her fingers found the first hay bale, moved it, found the second, moved it, found the third bale, reached beneath it, and located the concealed iron pin in the plow frame's base. She drew it out, found the wooden handle. From the front of the property came the sound of the farmhouse door being opened. She heard his footsteps on the porch boards, the specific, confident weight of a man who has never in his adult life entered a room he wasn't certain he owned. Eleanor pulled the handle. The counterweight engaged with a barely audible mechanical whisper. The trapdoor rose. She went down the ladder in 5 steps, reached up, caught the interior handle, and drew the door shut above her. The iron bolt was in her hand before the door was fully closed. She drove it home in the dark and stood at the bottom of the ladder, with her back against the frame and her hand pressed over her own mouth. Complete silence. Then from somewhere above and to her left, filtering down through the barn floor with the muffled quality of sound, passing through earth and stone and wood footsteps, slow, deliberate moving from the direction of the farmhouse toward the barn. She heard the barn's side door open. She heard him enter. The footsteps moved across the barn floor directly above her, with the careful, systematic quality of a man conducting an inspection rather than a search. Not frantic, not random, methodical. He was walking the perimeter of the old stall area, covering the space in overlapping passes, the way a lawyer moves through a deposition, eliminating sections one at a time. He stopped. I was standing, she calculated, by the sound approximately 8 feet from where she stood at the base of the ladder, which meant he was standing almost directly on top of the trapdoor. Eleanor stopped breathing. The silence from above stretched out to 15 seconds, then 30. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she was not normally aware of it, a heavy, unhurried percussion that seemed impossibly loud in the sealed space. Then she heard his voice, and the sound of it passing down through 2 feet of earth and stone and oak planking hit her somewhere below her sternum with a physical force she had not anticipated. Eleanor. Not a shout, not even raised. The same register he had used across 1,000 dinner tables in 100 quiet rooms. The voice of a man who had never needed to raise his voice because the architecture of every situation he entered had already been arranged to his advantage. The kettle wasn't singing yet, he said. The water hadn't reached temperature you left in the last 4 or 5 minutes. A pause. You didn't go into the trees. You wouldn't. Not in this wind. Not without knowing where you were going. Eleanor pressed her hand harder against her mouth and bit down on her knuckle until she tasted salt. You've been very industrious, he continued. The footsteps moved again slowly toward the plow frame corner. An LLC is clever. Clara Finch. I spent 3 months on that name before someone with the right access found the postal trail. His voice had the quality of a man reviewing a brief he had already won. You were always sloppy with paperwork, Eleanor. It was a consistent problem. The footsteps stopped again. He was at the plow frame now. She heard the flat palm of his hand strike the iron once, twice, testing the weight. The plow frame held. 300 pounds of iron sitting squarely on the concealed door did not announce itself as anything other than 300 pounds of iron. Come out now, he said. The measured tone did not change. The storm is accelerating. Whatever you think you've arranged here, I promise you it will be more comfortable to discuss it in the house than to have me take this barn apart in the cold. Silence from Eleanor. 2 minutes passed. 3. She heard him shift his weight. She heard something that might have been him exhaling through his nose with the particular quality of controlled impatience. Then the footsteps moved away from the corner. The barn door opened and shut. The sound of his boots on frozen ground moved back toward the farmhouse, and then that sound too was swallowed by the wind. Eleanor did not move for a full 10 minutes after he left. Then she crossed to the small shelf where she kept the ship's speaking tube she had run up through the wall during construction, a thin copper pipe that terminated somewhere in the barn's upper rafters, fitted with a horn to catch ambient sound. She lifted the rubber cap from the lower end and listened. Through the tube, she could hear the barn's interior, the groaning of the old roof timbers under the wind's growing pressure, the skitter of loose chaff against the boards, the voice of the storm working itself into something serious. Beneath all of that, from the direction of the farmhouse, the distant percussion of a man moving through a house he was systematically searching. She went to her supply shelf, took down a tin of beans, and ate it cold, standing up in the lantern light. She checked her provisions with the same inventory discipline she applied to everything, 14 weeks at minimum ration, which assumed the storm lasted no more than 4 days and rescue came before the 6-week mark. She had planned for a human threat. She had not needed to plan for weather because she had intended to weather any storm in the farmhouse upstairs. She was now in the farmhouse below. She sat on her wooden crate, wrapped a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders, and waited. By nightfall, the storm had stopped being weather and had become something else. The wind outside the barn transformed from a loud and unpleasant noise into a sustained roar that had no ceiling, a sound without variation or pause, like standing inside a mill with all the machinery running at once. Even buried as she was, she could feel the vibration of it in the granite floor under her boots. The barn above her was groaning continuously, the old timbers flexing in ways they had not been asked to flex in decades. She lay down on her cot and listened to the speaking tube. The farmhouse sounds had settled. He was in there, she knew, with her wood stove and her winter blankets and her pantry of preserved food, waiting for the storm to blow itself out so he could resume his search with greater leisure. She was in here with enough provisions to outlast him, and a door he could not open without equipment he did not have. For the first time since she had seen the carriage turn off the county road, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something adjacent to certainty, not safety. Certainty was not safety, but she had done the calculation and the calculation favored her. She closed her eyes. She woke at 3 in the morning with a headache behind her eyes and a dry, unpleasant sensation in her throat and lungs, and it took her several seconds of groggy disorientation to identify what she was actually experiencing. The lamp on the nearest wall bracket was burning low, not low on oil. The flame was reduced, compressed, struggling. The ventilation pipes. She was on her feet before she had finished the thought. 2 ceramic drainage pipes running at a shallow angle up through the wall and out through the barn's foundation. On a normal night, they provided adequate airflow. On a night with 4 feet of horizontal snow being driven at sustained high velocity against every vertical surface on the property, they had become sealed from the outside, both openings packed solid with compacted ice. The air in the room was being exhausted and not replaced. She had been breathing the same contained volume of air for hours. She went to the corner where she kept her father's tools and took out the iron probe rod, a 4-foot length of steel she had kept precisely for clearing the ventilation pipes in the event of blockage. She had thought when she installed it that the blockage she was guarding against would be birds or fallen debris. She had not engineered for a blizzard of this magnitude. The ceramic pipes entered the room through iron coupling rings set in the stone wall at shoulder height. She unscrewed the interior coupling on the nearer pipe by feel her fingers, already clumsy with the first stages of oxygen deprivation. The threads were tight, swollen slightly with cold. She stripped off her wool scarf and wrapped it around her hands for grip and put her full body weight into the turn. The coupling gave with a sharp crack that she felt in her wrists. She fed the probe rod into the open pipe and pushed. 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet. The rod met resistance, a dense, unyielding resistance that did not feel like debris, but like a wall packed snow compressed by the wind into something approaching the hardness of concrete. Her vision was beginning to grain at the edges. She recognized this. She had read about it. She understood precisely what was happening and what would happen next if she did not resolve it in the next several minutes. She pulled the rod back 2 feet and drove it forward again with everything she had left in her arms and shoulders. Pulled back, drove forward 3 times, 4 times. The 5th time she drove it, something shifted in the pipe with a sound like a muffled gunshot, and then a column of snow came cascading back down the pipe and spilled out across the stone floor in a dense white mass, and behind it, screaming in from outside at the full force of the storm, came a jet of air so cold it felt like a physical blow against her face and chest. She sat down on the floor directly beneath the open pipe and let that Arctic air fill her lungs. It burned going in. It was the most uncomplicated relief she had felt in years. The dark spots at the edges of her vision began to clear. She sat there for 3 full minutes, breathing carefully, letting her body re-establish its chemistry. Then she got up, replaced the coupling as tightly as she could manage, and went back to her cot. She did not sleep again. She lay in the lantern light and listened to the storm working on the old barn roof above her, and thought with careful, disciplined attention about what she knew and what she did not know. What she knew, Cornelius was in the farmhouse. The storm was serious and growing more serious. Her provisions were adequate. Her door was sound. What she did not know, how long the storm would last, whether the barn roof, which she had assessed as structurally marginal when she first arrived, could sustain the load it was being asked to carry. She had noted the roof's condition in the 2nd month after her arrival and had made a deliberate calculation at the time. Repairing a barn roof required hired labor and materials, both of which created visibility. She had chosen invisibility over structural soundness, intending to address the roof in her 2nd year when she was more established. It was, in retrospect, the one miscalculation in an otherwise carefully reasoned plan. The wind outside climbed another register. She heard it in the timber above a new pitch of stress in the old joinery, the sound of wood being asked to do more than it was built for. Then she heard something else. Through the speaking tube, over the voice of the storm, came a sound from the farmhouse direction. Not the sound of a man waiting out bad weather. The sound of something wrong, a dull, repetitive bang, then a long pause, then the bang again faster, with an edge of desperation that had no place in the controlled behavior of the man she had known. Eleanor sat up. She pressed her ear close to the tube and listened. The banging from the farmhouse stopped. For perhaps 3 minutes there was nothing but the storm, and then she smelled it. It came through the ventilation pipe rather than the speaking tube, faint but specific, a thin ribbon of odor threading down through the packed snow and earth wood smoke, not the clean smell of a well-burning fire. This was the sharp, acrid smell of combustion being choked by its own output, the smell of a flue that was not drawing of wood burning in a space that could not exhaust itself. She understood immediately. Cornelius had grown up in a townhouse in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. He had attended Harvard and then Harvard Law. In 14 years of marriage, he had never once built a fire anywhere that did not already have a staff member responsible for the building of it. He would have gone to the kitchen wood stove in the farmhouse as the temperature